Picture this: a man in a perfectly made suit, a red flower pinned to his jacket, stepping out of a bright yellow Rolls-Royce onto the Atlantic City boardwalk. He tips his hat to women walking by. Children wave at him, police officers nod with respect. But this man, this charming, kind person the city calls Nucky, he controls everything: the alcohol, the gambling, the girls, politics, the police, everything. His name was Enoch Nucky Johnson, and for 30 years, he didn't just run Atlantic City, he was Atlantic City. This is the true story of America's most powerful political boss, who ruled with what they called a velvet hammer. No violence, no murders. Just money, charm, and complete control. But every empire falls, and when his did, it shook the entire nation. Before we dive deep into Nucky's amazing rise and dramatic fall, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your location and the time in the comments below. Are you listening to this at 2:00 a.m.? Or maybe you're on your way to work, doing chores, or getting ready for bed. And hey, if you're into these deep dive gangster stories that help you relax or fall asleep, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Smash that like button if you're ready to hear about the most amazing political gangster America has ever seen. Share this with anyone who loves true crime, history, or just incredible stories about power and bad behavior. Alright, let's get comfortable. Grab your headphones, settle in, and let me take you back to Atlantic City in the early 1900s. Enoch Johnson came into the world on January 20th, 1883 in Galloway Township, New Jersey, later known as Smithville. He was born during a time when American politics was changing a lot. The Gilded Age was giving way to something called the Progressive Era. But in the halls of power in places like Atlantic County, the old ways would stay around for many more years. His parents, Smith E. Johnson and Virginia Higby Johnson, came from old Protestant families with deep roots in Atlantic County. These weren't new immigrants trying to make it in America. These were established Americans, the kind who could trace their family back many generations and knew the value of land, connections, and political jobs. The Johnsons and the Higbys were solid Methodist people, respectable, ambitious, and already connected to the people who had power in their corner of New Jersey. The boy's given name, Enoch, came from the Bible, but the nickname that would define him came almost right away. Nucky was what family and friends called young Enoch, a cute nickname that would surprisingly become one of the most powerful names in American political corruption. There's something almost funny about it. The cute nickname attached to the man who would eventually work with the most famous gangsters in American history. But perhaps that was always part of his charm. The friendly Nucky, never the formal distant Mr. Johnson. The path of Nucky's life was set in 1886 when he was just 3 years old. That year, his father, Smith E. Johnson, won the election as sheriff of Atlantic County. The family moved from rural Galloway Township to Mays Landing, the county seat where young Nucky would spend his growing up years, literally living in the shadow of the county jail and courthouse. Imagine growing up with that as your backyard, the physical symbol of law and order, punishment and power for most children. It might have made them respect the law. For Nucky, it seems to have taught him how bendable the law could be when you controlled the men who enforced it. Smith Johnson was more than just a sheriff. He was part of a group of 3 leaders that ruled Atlantic County with strong discipline. Alongside County Clerk Lewis P. Scott and Congressman John J. Gardner, Smith Johnson formed the leadership of the Republican machine that controlled local politics. This wasn't democracy in the high-minded way taught in school classes. This was machine politics. The exchange of votes for jobs, loyalty for favors, political support for protection. The 3 men met regularly, often at the hotel owned by Louis Kunnel, a rising power in Atlantic City. They made decisions that affected thousands of lives, gave out jobs, and made sure that the Republican Party kept its tight hold on county government. Young Nucky watched and learned. New Jersey law at the time said sheriffs couldn't serve back-to-back terms. A reform meant to stop one person from having too much power. So Smith Johnson and his friends developed a rotating system, one term as sheriff, one term as under-sheriff, back and forth. The law was technically followed, but its spirit was completely broken. Power stayed exactly where it had always been. This was Nucky's first lesson in the art of corruption. Follow the letter of the law while destroying what it really meant. It was a lesson he would use perfectly throughout his career. The Johnson home in Mays Landing became a center of political activity. Politicians came and went. Deals were made at the dinner table. Favors were asked for and given. Nucky grew up understanding that government wasn't some abstract thing dedicated to helping people. It was a tool, a machine that made power and money for those who knew how to work it. His father and his father's colleagues weren't public servants in the idealistic sense. They were businessmen whose business happened to be government. Atlantic County in the 1880s and 1890s was changing. Atlantic City, established in 1854, was changing from a small beach village into a major vacation spot. The railroad had arrived in 1854, making the shore easy to reach for Philadelphia's residents. Hotels were popping up, the famous Boardwalk, originally built in 1870 to keep sand out of hotel lobbies, was growing. Entertainers, tourists, and business people were discovering that Americans wanted to escape their everyday lives, and Atlantic City was perfectly positioned to give them that escape. But with tourism came vice. Gambling had always existed, of course. Humans have been gambling since before we had written records. Prostitution, too, was called the world's oldest profession for a reason. What changed in Atlantic City was the size and the quiet understanding that these activities would be allowed, even protected, as long as the right people got their cut. This wasn't unique to Atlantic City. Almost every American city had its red light district, its gambling houses, its corrupt police force. But Atlantic City was building its entire economy around being the place where such things were not just allowed, but celebrated. The men who controlled Atlantic County politics, including Smith Johnson, understood the money value of vice. Strict enforcement of morality laws would drive tourists to other vacation spots. Loose enforcement would bring them flooding in. The choice was obvious, at least to men who measured success in votes and dollars rather than in moral purity. A system developed. Vice operators paid protection money, which was given out among police, politicians, and party officials. In exchange, they ran their businesses without worry. It was corruption, certainly, but it was organized corruption. It was systematic corruption. It was corruption as city policy. Young Nucky took all of this in. He watched his father hold court, hand out justice, collect tribute. He saw how power really worked. Stripped of all the patriotic talk and democratic idealism, he learned that the world was divided into those who controlled and those who were controlled, and that the difference between the two often came down to knowing the right people and being willing to bend the rules. By the time Nucky graduated from Atlantic City High School in 1898, he was 17 years old and already marked for a political career. His education had been good. He was intelligent, well-spoken, clear in his speech. But the real education hadn't come from textbooks. It had come from watching his father work, from understanding how patronage and protection worked, from learning that power and money were deeply connected. Nucky briefly signed up at New Jersey State Normal School, now the College of New Jersey, to study English literature. It's interesting to imagine what might have been. Nucky Johnson, English professor, perhaps writing scholarly papers on Victorian poetry or Shakespeare's political plays. But that alternate reality never happened. The pull of politics, of real power, was too strong. Education could make you knowledgeable. Politics could make you rich and powerful. For an ambitious young man who'd grown up watching his father work the levers of county government, the choice was obvious in 1902. At just 19 years old, Nucky became his father's undersheriff in Mays Landing. The title sounds minor, almost ceremonial. But in the context of the Atlantic County Republican machine, it was training in power. Nucky learned the practical skills of law enforcement and political control, who to arrest and who to ignore, which laws to enforce and which to overlook, how to manage employees, how to collect protection money without creating a paper trail, how to keep order while allowing disorder. He was a quick learner. Nucky had inherited his father's impressive physical presence. He would eventually stand over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, and powerfully built. But he also had something his father lacked: a photographic memory for faces and names. This perfect memory would become one of his greatest strengths. In an era before computers or even efficient filing systems, the ability to remember every person you'd ever met, their family connections, their political loyalties, their debts and obligations, that was power. Nucky could meet someone once and remember them years later. Recall their wife's name, ask about their children, mention a favor he'd done for them. It created bonds of loyalty and obligation that were more valuable than any record book. In November 1906, at age 23, Nucky married his sweetheart Mabel Jeffries. She was from a local family, respectable, appropriate for an up-and-coming young politician. The marriage seemed to promise a normal path, steady advancement through county politics, perhaps eventually a seat in the state legislature. A comfortable middle-class life, built on government salaries and the quiet corruption that everyone did, but nobody talked about. But normal was never going to be enough for Nucky Johnson. Even as he played the role of dutiful undersheriff and young husband, he was making connections, building relationships, and most importantly, drawing closer to the man who would change his life. Louis Cunnell, Louis the Commodore. Cunnell was everything Nucky's father wasn't. Where Smith Johnson was a county sheriff focused on the mechanics of law enforcement and vote-getting, Cunnell was a visionary. He looked at Atlantic City and saw not just another beach town, but the potential for something never seen before: America's playground. A city built entirely on giving people what they wanted, regardless of what the law said they should want. Cunnell had started as a hotel owner and restaurant owner, but by the early 1900s, he was emerging as Atlantic City's political boss. His hotel became the unofficial headquarters of the county Republican machine, the place where Smith Johnson, Lewis P. Scott, and John J. Gardner held their meetings, made their decisions, and divided their earnings. Young Nucky was often present at these gatherings, initially as his father's helper, but increasingly as someone the older men recognized as sharp, capable, and ambitious. The Commodore's philosophy was simple and cynical. Tourists came to Atlantic City to escape the restrictions of their everyday lives. They wanted to drink, gamble, visit prostitutes, and do all the activities that Victorian morality and progressive-era reform movements were trying to stop. If Atlantic City would guarantee them a safe space to do these things, they would come in huge numbers and they would bring their money. This required a complete corruption of the law enforcement and political systems. It wasn't enough to have a few cops taking bribes or a few politicians willing to look the other way. The entire machine of government had to be organized toward the protection of vice. Police had to arrest only those who failed to pay protection money. Judges had to dismiss charges against the connected while punishing independents who tried to operate without permission. Politicians had to prevent reform movements from gaining strength. And all of this had to be done quietly enough that the state government didn't feel forced to step in. Cunnell built this system with ruthless efficiency. By 1908, he was the undisputed boss of Atlantic City. Mayors, city council members, police chiefs, all answered to the Commodore. The protection racket was sophisticated and complete. Every gambling den, every brothel, every Sunday bar that served alcohol in violation of New Jersey's blue laws, they all paid. The money flowed up through the organization to the Commodore and his inner circle. A portion went to the Republican Party for campaign expenses. A portion went to the police for looking the other way. A portion went into the pockets of politicians for passing favorable laws or blocking unfavorable reforms. And a portion, a very large portion, stayed with Kunal himself. Nucky watched and learned. He saw how the Commodore wielded power not through violence, but through systematic corruption. He saw how money could buy silence, loyalty, and protection. He saw how a well-organized machine could openly run illegal activities without fear of being caught. Most importantly, he saw the money, God, the money. More money than his father had ever made as sheriff. More money than any legitimate businessman in Atlantic County could hope to earn. Money that could buy bright yellow Rolls Royces and penthouse suites and everything else that separated the powerful from the powerless. In 1908, when Smith Johnson's term as sheriff ended, Nucky ran for and won the position. He was just 25 years old. But he was no longer just the sheriff's son. He was Sheriff Johnson, a position of real authority. And he was firmly aligned with Kunal's machine. The training was over. Nucky was now a player. But Nucky also realized something that would save his career. Kunal was becoming too visible, too arrogant. The Commodore had grown used to absolute power. And absolute power was making him careless. Reform was in the air. The progressive movement was gaining strength nationally. Muckraking journalists were exposing corruption in cities across America. Sooner or later, someone was going to take a run at Atlantic City. And when they did, Kunal would be the target. In 1909, Nucky received an appointment as secretary of the Atlantic County Republican Executive Committee. It was a seemingly minor position, but it placed him at the very center of the political machine. He knew every candidate, every campaign, every political deal. He was positioning himself not just as Kunal's enforcer, but as his possible successor. He didn't have to wait long. In 1910, New Jersey elected a new governor, Woodrow Wilson. Democrat and progressive reformer, Wilson had made his name as president of Princeton University. And he came to the governorship with a missionary zeal for cleaning up New Jersey's notorious political corruption. Atlantic City, with its open vice and machine politics, was an obvious target. Wilson launched a complete investigation into Atlantic City's government. Over 100 people were eventually charged on various counts of corruption, election fraud, and conspiracy. The charges read like a who's who of Atlantic County politics. At the center was Louis Kunal, and right beside him, facing his own charges, Enoch Nucky Johnson. The trial began in 1911 and became a sensation. Newspapers across the state covered it. The prosecution presented evidence of systematic corruption, of protection money collected and given out, of elections rigged and laws broken. They had witnesses, documents, testimony from former machine workers who turned state's evidence. The case against Kunal was strong. The case against his associates, including Nucky, seemed equally solid. But here's where Nucky's intelligence and his careful positioning paid off. Unlike Kunal, who had been at the center of everything, who had personally collected money and given orders, Nucky had kept some distance. He had been careful about what he put in writing. He had let middlemen handle the most obviously illegal transactions. He had, in essence, learned from watching his father how to work within the machine while maintaining deniability. When the verdicts came down, Kunal was convicted on election fraud and corruption charges. He was sentenced to prison. His political career was over. His empire was in ruins. The Commodore, the man who had built the Boardwalk machine, was finished. Nucky Johnson was found not guilty. Think about what that meant. The boss goes to prison. The protege walks free. Everyone in the organization knows Nucky was involved, knows he took money, knows he participated in the corruption. But the government couldn't prove it beyond reasonable doubt, or perhaps more accurately. Nucky had been smart enough to avoid leaving the kind of evidence that could convict him. But the legal acquittal wasn't the end of it. A court order removed Nucky from his position as sheriff in 1911. He lost the office he'd held for 3 years. For most politicians, this would have been the end. A career destroyed, a reputation ruined, even if the criminal charges hadn't stuck. Nucky saw it differently. Kunal was gone. The machine was leaderless. The organization that controlled Atlantic City needed someone to step in. Someone who understood how the system worked. Someone with connections to all the key players. Someone with the intelligence and ambition to rebuild what Wilson's prosecution had torn down. In 1913, at age 30, Enoch Nucky Johnson picked up what he later called Kunal's toga, the mantle of Atlantic City's political boss. The student had become the master. The training was complete. The era of Nucky Johnson had begun. But before he could solidify power, tragedy struck in 1912, 1 year after Nucky's acquittal, and just as he was positioning himself to seize control of Atlantic City's political machine. His wife Mabel died. She was young. They both were. And her death was sudden and devastating. The historical record doesn't give extensive details about Mabel's death, but the impact on Nucky is clear. Up until Mabel's death, Nucky had been a teetotaler. In an era when drinking alcohol was common and when his political work put him in constant contact with bars, speakeasies, and bootleggers, Nucky had abstained. Whether this was personal preference, religious conviction, he was raised Methodist, or political calculation is unclear, but after Mabel's death, everything changed. Nucky began drinking. Not just socially, but heavily. He became known as someone who could drink remarkable amounts of alcohol without losing his composure or his mental sharpness. This ability to drink anyone under the table while remaining in control became part of his legend. The political boss who could party all night with gangsters and tourists, then wake up the next morning sharp and focused, ready to conduct the business of running a city. But one must wonder about the pain beneath the public persona. Nucky would not remarry for nearly 30 years. Not until 1941, just days before entering federal prison. For 3 decades he lived alone, apart from servants, worked obsessively, built his empire, and spent his nights in the company of showgirls, politicians, and gangsters. But apparently never found or looked for another wife. The man who had everything Atlantic City could offer. Money, power, respect, fear, didn't have love. Did Mabel's death harden him, make him more ruthless, more focused on power and money because personal happiness had been taken from him? We can only guess, but the timing is notable. Mabel died in 1912. Nucky took control of the organization in 1913. The grieving husband became the absolute boss. Perhaps grief and ambition are not so different. Both are all-consuming. Both drive men to extremes. Both can hollow you out and fill the empty space with something else entirely. With Kunal in prison and Mabel in her grave, Nucky threw himself into the work of rebuilding and expanding the political machine. His first move was brilliant. Rather than run for office himself, he accepted an appointment as Atlantic County Treasurer in 1913, a position he would hold until 1941. This deserves emphasis because it reveals Nucky's political genius. The county treasurer wasn't a high-profile position. It didn't carry the prestige of mayor or sheriff or state senator. But it had 3 crucial advantages. First, it was appointed, not elected. Nucky didn't have to face voters every few years. He didn't have to campaign or make promises or worry about reform movements kicking him out. Once appointed, he was protected from direct Democratic accountability. Second, the position gave him control over county finances. He could see where the money went, who was being paid what, which contractors were getting which jobs. Financial information is power. the ability to audit, investigate, or simply know who owes what to whom. Third, it was boring. Newspapers didn't write about the county treasurer. Reform movements didn't target that office. It was beneath notice, which meant Nucky could work from it with relative freedom. But Nucky didn't stop at the county treasurer. Over the next few years, he collected positions like a man collecting playing cards. Tax collector, newspaper publisher, bank director, building and loan company president, director of a Philadelphia brewery. Some of these were legitimate business interests. Others were covers for political power or ways to clean illegal income. All of them enhanced his wealth and influence. By 1919, his political influence was so complete that Governor Walter Edge, whom Nucky had helped elect in 1916, appointed him clerk of the New Jersey Supreme Court. This was extraordinary, the clerk of the state's highest court, a position of enormous prestige and access to the state's legal machinery, was held by a man everyone knew was the boss of a corrupt political machine. But Edge owed Nucky his election. And in machine politics, debts must be paid. Nucky now controlled Atlantic County from top to bottom. The Republican Party organization answered to him. Through carefully placed allies, he controlled the city government. The police department took its orders from him. Judges knew who had put them on the bench. Every significant economic decision in the county, which contractors got construction jobs, which businesses received favorable treatment, which investors got inside information. All of it flowed through Nucky, but control isn't the same as love. And this is where Nucky distinguished himself from typical corrupt politicians. He understood that an effective political machine can't rule solely through fear and corruption. It needs to deliver benefits to ordinary people. It needs to create loyalty, not just obedience. So Nucky became the city's benefactor. Jobs were given out from his office. If you needed work, you went to see Nucky. If you needed help with a legal problem, Nucky knew a judge. If your business needed a permit or a license or a zoning change, Nucky could arrange it. The 9th floor of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, where Nucky held court, became a strange combination of political office, employment agency, and court of last resort. This wasn't pure altruism, of course. Every favor created an obligation. Every job given was a vote owed. Every problem solved was leverage gained. But from the recipient's perspective, Nucky was a godsend. A powerful man who actually helped ordinary people. This created a reservoir of genuine popular support that would protect him for decades. As one Atlantic City resident later recalled, when Nucky lived well, everybody lived well. It wasn't quite true. Plenty of Atlantic City residents lived in poverty, even during Nucky's reign. But it was true enough. The city prospered. Jobs were plentiful, money flowed, and Nucky made sure that his generosity was visible, public, and remembered. By the early 1920s, Nucky Johnson had perfected his public image. He was no longer just a political boss. He was a celebrity, a character, the very symbol of Atlantic City itself. His physical presence was commanding, standing over 6 feet tall. Broad-shouldered and powerfully built, Nucky dominated any room he entered. But it wasn't just his size, it was how he carried himself. The confidence, the assumption of authority, the complete lack of doubt or hesitation. When Nucky spoke, people listened. When he smiled, they relaxed. When he frowned, they worried. This was natural charisma, amplified by decades of absolute power. The signature red carnation in his buttonhole became famous. Fresh every day, perfectly positioned. It was both a symbol of his wealth, who has fresh flowers daily, and his attention to detail. The carnation said, "I care about appearances. I notice the small things. I have standards, don't disappoint me." His suits were legendary, tailored from the finest fabrics, cut to perfection. Each one cost more than most Atlantic City workers earned in months. He wore them with the casual confidence of a man who knew he looked good and didn't need to think about it. Gold cufflinks, silk ties, hand-stitched shoes. Every element was perfect. Nucky understood that in politics, appearance is reality. Looking powerful made you powerful. And then there was the car. The famous bright yellow Rolls-Royce Phantom. Worth $14,000 in an era when the average annual income was around $1,400. It was flashy, deliberately so. When that car glided down the boardwalk, everyone knew who was inside. The car wasn't just transportation, it was a statement. I have more money than you can imagine. I am above you. Nucky's living arrangements were equally extravagant. He owned the entire 9th floor of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. The finest hotel in Atlantic City, his suite overlooked the ocean. Decorated with expensive furniture and artwork. He employed a Russian valet named Louis Kessel. 2 chauffeurs and 3 maids. His staff roster read like minor royalty. And indeed, that's essentially what he was. The king of Atlantic City, holding court in his oceanfront palace. His appetite was legendary. Nucky was described as a trencherman. Someone who ate enormously. His daily diet featured lobster, caviar, steaks 3 inches thick. He spent $3,000 annually on food alone, equal to over $50,000 in today's money. This wasn't mere gluttony. It was another display of power and wealth. While other Americans scraped by, Nucky feasted. His sexual appetites were reportedly just as big. Contemporary descriptions called him a Herculean lover, which in the coded language of the era meant he was known for entertaining multiple showgirls and maintaining numerous affairs. Atlantic City was full of beautiful women. Entertainers, showgirls, prostitutes, and Nucky had his pick. He never remarried after Mabel's death, but he certainly didn't remain celibate. By 1925, Nucky's collection of cars had expanded to 4 brand new Cadillacs in addition to the famous Rolls-Royce. He had a cottage near his Ritz-Carlton suite. He kept an apartment in New York City on Central Park, spending $2,200 annually on rent alone. Again, a staggering sum for the era. He spent $3,000 a year on clothing. His officially reported annual income was around $40,000 as county treasurer and from his various legitimate business interests. His actual income, as federal investigators would later document, exceeded $500,000 annually, over $8 million in current dollars. But perhaps Nucky's most powerful asset wasn't visible. It was his memory, his photographic recall of faces, names, and personal details was legendary. Meet Nucky once, and he would remember you years later. He'd recall your wife's name, your children, where you worked, what favor you'd asked for. This created an incredible impression of personal attention and care. It made people feel valued, seen, important. And it gave Nucky leverage. He never forgot what you owed him either. This combination, physical presence, perfect style, lavish displays of wealth, personal charm, and perfect memory, made Nucky Johnson more than just a political boss. He became an icon, a character, a legend. Children waved at him. Women wanted to be seen with him. Men wanted to be him. He was living proof that crime, or at least corruption, could pay spectacularly well. On January 17, 1920, the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution took effect, prohibiting the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages. The Volstead Act, passed to enforce the amendment, defined intoxicating liquor and established penalties for violations. After decades of campaigning by temperance movements, moral reformers, and progressive activists, America had officially gone dry. It was one of the greatest policy disasters in American history. And for Enoch Nucky Johnson, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. The problems with Prohibition were obvious from the start. Millions of Americans drank and saw nothing wrong with it. The law made normal behavior criminal. even wholesome activities like moderate drinking at dinner. A glass of wine at church, a beer after work, all suddenly illegal. This created a massive market for illegal alcohol and transformed ordinary citizens into criminals. Enter the bootleggers within months of Prohibition taking effect. Organized criminal enterprises sprang up to supply the demand in major cities. Gang wars erupted over territory in Chicago. Al Capone would eventually gross an estimated $100 million annually from bootlegging. In New York, Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky built empires on illegal alcohol. Across America, Prohibition wasn't stopping drinking. It was just channeling all the money to criminals. But Atlantic City had a unique advantage. It had always flouted morality laws long before Prohibition. The city had allowed gambling, prostitution, and Sunday alcohol sales in violation of New Jersey's blue laws. The police, politicians, and courts were already systematically corrupt. The infrastructure for protecting illegal activity already existed. All Nucky had to do was expand it to include bootlegging, and expand it he did. Atlantic City became one of the wettest cities in America. Hotels served alcohol openly in their restaurants and bars. Nightclubs advertised their drink menus. Speakeasies weren't speakeasy at all. They were loud, public, and completely unafraid of police raids. Tourists flocked to the city specifically because they could drink legally there. Or rather, they could drink without fear of arrest. Technically, it was still illegal, but the police were on Nucky's payroll. Nucky's philosophy, which he stated openly to reporters, was beautifully cynical. We have whiskey, wine, women, song, and slot machines. I won't deny it, and I won't apologize for it. If the majority of the people didn't want them, they wouldn't be profitable, and they wouldn't exist. The fact that they do exist proves to me that the people want them. It was market economics, supply and demand. The people wanted alcohol, Nucky supplied it. The people wanted gambling, Nucky allowed it. The people wanted sex. Nucky protected the brothels. He was in his own mind. Simply a businessman meeting market demand. That the market was illegal was merely a technicality. The city's marketing explicitly promoted its flouting of Prohibition. Atlantic City called itself the world's playground, and the implicit message was clear. Here, the normal rules don't apply. Come drink, gamble, carouse. The law won't find you here. Nucky won't allow it. Bootlegging became Nucky's primary income source. He didn't run the operations directly. He wasn't smuggling alcohol himself or managing warehouses instead. He took a percentage on every gallon of illegal liquor that came into or was sold in Atlantic City. Think of it as a tax, except the tax collector was a corrupt political boss rather than the government. Every speakeasy operator, every bootlegger, every hotel that served drinks, they all paid Nucky. It was systematic, efficient, and enormously profitable. In 1920, Nucky helped get Republican Edward Batter elected as mayor. Batter was a contractor, and through his construction business, Atlantic City embarked on an ambitious building program. The crown jewel was Atlantic City Convention Hall, completed in 1929 at a cost of $15 million. Over $240 million in today's dollars. At the time, it was the largest convention hall in the world. Capable of seating 41,000 people, it was magnificent, modern, and built with a combination of taxpayer money and revenue from Vice. Atlantic City was using bootlegging profits to build legitimate infrastructure. Nucky was turning crime into civic improvement. By the mid-1920s, Atlantic City had over 1,200 hotels and boarding houses, all catering to tourists who came for the beaches and stayed for the sin. The city was booming, money poured in from every direction, and Nucky took his cut from all of it. But Nucky understood something crucial. Bootlegging on this scale required organization beyond Atlantic City. The alcohol had to come from somewhere. It had to be transported, distributed, protected. This required coordination with other criminal enterprises, other cities, other bosses. It required what would eventually become known as the National Crime Syndicate. And that meant doing business with the most dangerous men in America. By the mid-1920s, bootlegging had become big business, not just in Atlantic City, but across America. In every major city, criminal organizations had seized control of the illegal alcohol trade. But this created problems. Gangsters fought over territory. Bootleggers hijacked each other's shipments. Violence attracted police attention and federal intervention. It was bad for business. Some of the smarter gangsters recognized that cooperation would be more profitable than conflict, rather than fighting over scraps. They could divide territories and coordinate operations, rather than competition. Collaboration, rather than gang wars, business arrangements. By 1928 to 1929, a loose organization called the Big Seven, also known as the Seven Group, was formed. It included some of the most powerful bootleggers on the East Coast. Arnold Rothstein, the man who allegedly fixed the 1919 World Series. Rothstein was New York's most sophisticated criminal. He wasn't a thug. He was a businessman who happened to operate in illegal markets. He understood money, leverage, and power in ways that most gangsters couldn't comprehend. Charles Lucky Luciano, a lieutenant in the Mafia crime family. Luciano was young, ambitious, and ruthless. But he was also intelligent enough to see that the old ways, the ethnic gangs, the endless violence, the Sicilian traditions were holding organized crime back. He envisioned something more modern, more American, more efficient. Johnny Torrio, formerly the boss of the Chicago South Side Gang. Torrio had retired from active leadership but remained influential. He had been Al Capone's mentor and had taught him the bootlegging business. Torrio was a strategic thinker, a planner, a man who preferred organization to chaos. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, young, handsome, violent, and utterly fearless, Siegel was part of the Bugs and Meyer mob along with Meyer Lansky. Siegel was the muscle to Lansky's brains. But he was more than just an enforcer. He had vision, ambition, and a willingness to take risks that would eventually lead him to help create Las Vegas. Meyer Lansky, perhaps the most brilliant criminal mind of the era. Lansky was a financial genius, while other gangsters thought in terms of neighborhoods and turf wars. Lansky thought in terms of markets, investments, and international operations. He would eventually become one of the architects of the National Crime Syndicate and one of the most powerful men in American organized crime. Frank Kostlow, suave, sophisticated, politically connected. Kostlow was the prime minister of the Underworld. He understood that the key to long-term success in organized crime wasn't violence, but corruption. Bribe the right people, own the right politicians, and you could operate with impunity. And at the center of it all, coordinating East Coast operations, providing a safe haven for meetings and negotiations. Enoch Nucky Johnson, Nucky's role in the Big Seven was unique. He wasn't primarily a bootlegger himself. He didn't run smuggling operations or manage distribution networks. His value was political. He controlled Atlantic City completely. He could guarantee that meetings wouldn't be raided, that operations wouldn't be interfered with, that the police would look the other way. He provided what every criminal organization needs, a safe base of operations. In exchange, Nucky took his percentage, not from running the operations, but from allowing them to run. It was a typically clever arrangement. All the profit, none of the direct criminal liability. Or so he thought. Atlantic City became one of the leading ports for importing bootleg liquor. Ships would arrive from Canada, the Caribbean, or Europe, loaded with high-quality whiskey, rum, and wine. The cargo would be unloaded, distributed through networks that ran up and down the East Coast, and sold for enormous profits. And every step of that process, as it passed through or near Atlantic City, generated revenue for Nucky. But Nucky's greatest contribution to organized crime wasn't financial. It was diplomatic. Unlike many gangster bosses, Nucky didn't believe in violence as a primary tool. He believed in negotiation, compromise, mutual benefit. When disputes arose between different criminal organizations, Nucky would often serve as mediator when planning was needed for large-scale operations. Nucky's political connections and organizational skills were invaluable. This approach, the Velvet Hammer philosophy, would reach its peak in May 1929, when Nucky hosted what became the most famous gangster summit in American history. Around this same time, in the mid to late 1920s, Nucky met a young man who would become his closest associate and eventual successor, Jimmy Boyd. The meeting occurred at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, where Boyd worked as a bellhop. He was young, born in 1904, making him 23 years younger than Nucky. But something about the young man caught Nucky's attention. Perhaps it was Boyd's intelligence, his street smarts, his ambition. Perhaps Nucky saw in Boyd a younger version of himself, hungry, capable, willing to bend or break rules to get ahead. Or perhaps, after nearly 2 decades of living alone since Mabel's death, Nucky simply wanted something close to a family connection, even if it was with a helper rather than a son. Whatever the reason, Nucky took Boyd under his wing. He began training the young bellhop to eventually take over the organization. This was unusual for its time. Most gangster bosses didn't plan for succession. They died violently or went to prison, and their organizations broke apart or were taken over by rivals. But Nucky was thinking long-term. He was building an institution, not just running a criminal enterprise. Boyd proved to be a quick learner. He was loyal, capable, and ruthless when necessary. Nucky gave him increasing responsibility, testing him, teaching him the business. Eventually, Boyd became Nucky's top enforcer and right-hand man. Nucky placed Boyd in control of the 4th Ward, the heart of Atlantic City's Vice District. This was where the brothels, gambling dens, and speakeasies were concentrated. This was where the real money was made. And Nucky trusted Boyd to manage it all, collecting protection money, settling disputes, dealing with uncooperative operators, ensuring that everything ran smoothly and profitably. Boyd partnered with Herman "Stumpy" Orman, a local tough guy who handled the physical enforcement when it was needed. Together, Boyd and Orman managed the day-to-day operations of Atlantic City's underworld. They collected the money, paid off the police, dealt with problems, and reported back to Nucky. The relationship between Nucky and Boyd developed into something close to a father-son dynamic. Nucky had no children of his own. Boyd apparently saw in Nucky a mentor and father figure. There was genuine affection alongside the business relationship, and crucially, Boyd remained loyal. Even after Nucky's fall, even after the empire crumbled, Boyd would continue running the organization. He would maintain Nucky's system well into the 1970s, nearly 30 years after Nucky went to prison. This loyalty, this long-term thinking, this careful training of a successor, it all demonstrates that Nucky was more sophisticated than the typical gangster boss. He wasn't just grabbing power and money in the moment. He was building something meant to last. He was thinking institutionally, creating a system that could survive beyond him. It's one of the aspects that makes Nucky Johnson so fascinating. He was a criminal, certainly. He was corrupt, absolutely. But he was also a planner, an organizer, a builder of institutions. He was thinking like a CEO, not like a thug. And in May 1929, that organizational skill would be tested like never before when he hosted a gathering that would change American organized crime forever. In early May 1929, Meyer Lansky was preparing to marry his longtime girlfriend. Anna Citron Lansky, always the thinker, always the planner, had an idea. What if his honeymoon doubled as the first ever national conference of organized crime leaders? What if the major bootleggers, gangsters, and mob bosses from across America could gather in one place under protection to discuss the future of their business. The idea appealed to several of the Big Seven members, particularly Johnny Torrio, Lucky Luciano, and Frank Costello. The timing was perfect, or perhaps perfectly terrible, depending on your perspective. Just 3 months earlier, on Valentine's Day, 1929, 7 members of Bugs Moran's gang had been machine-gunned to death in a Chicago garage. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre had shocked America and brought unprecedented attention to gangland violence. Federal authorities were getting serious about cracking down on organized crime. Something needed to change. The Chicago gang wars, in particular, were out of control. Al Capone's organization was fighting with the North Side Gang. People were dying in the streets. Newspapers were calling Chicago a war zone. This was bad for everyone's business. Violence attracted attention. Attention attracted law enforcement. Law enforcement disrupted operations and cut into profits. What organized crime needed was exactly what legitimate business had: coordination, agreed-upon territories, mechanisms for resolving disputes without violence. They needed to stop acting like street gangs and start acting like corporations. They needed a summit. For the location, the choice was obvious: Atlantic City. Nucky Johnson controlled the city completely. There would be no police raids. Number federal interference, no problems. Nucky's brother, Alfred, was now the Atlantic County Sheriff, providing even more protection. Atlantic City was perfect. A neutral site, controlled territory, and as a tourist destination. Dozens of gangsters checking into hotels wouldn't attract unusual attention. The conference was scheduled for May 13th to 16th, 1929. Invitations went out to major crime figures across the country. This would be unprecedented. The first time that leaders of Italian, Jewish, Irish, and other ethnic criminal organizations would meet together to discuss common interests. It would be the birth of what would become known as the National Crime Syndicate. As May 13th approached, gangsters began arriving in Atlantic City. They came by car and train, traveling from Chicago, New York, Detroit, Philadelphia, Cleveland, and Boston. They checked into Atlantic City's finest hotels, registering under obvious fake names. Some brought their wives or girlfriends. Meyer Lansky, of course, brought his new bride, Anna. The initial plan was to house everyone at the Breakers Hotel, one of Atlantic City's most prestigious establishments. But there was a problem that nobody had anticipated, and it would lead to one of the most dramatic moments of the entire conference. May 13th, 1929, afternoon. A convoy of expensive cars pulls up to the Breakers Hotel. Out step some of the most dangerous men in America. Accompanied by their elegantly dressed wives and girlfriends, they approach the front desk, ready to check in for what they've been told is a 4-day conference. And they're turned away. The Breakers Hotel, it turns out, had a strict white Anglo-Saxon Protestant-only policy. Despite the Anglo-Saxon-sounding fake names the gangsters had registered under, the hotel staff took one look at the group, obviously Italian, obviously Jewish, obviously not the right sort of people for an establishment like the Breakers, and refused them service. Al Capone, who had arrived from Chicago, exploded. He began screaming at the hotel staff, demanding service, threatening lawsuits, and worse. He turned on Nucky Johnson, who had organized the accommodations, and let loose a torrent of profanity. How could Nucky, who supposedly controlled everything in Atlantic City, allow them to be humiliated like this? How could he not know about the hotel's policy? This was an insult, a disgrace, according to some accounts. Capone actually took a swing at Nucky in the hotel lobby. This was a mistake. Nucky stood over 6 feet tall and outweighed Capone by a considerable margin. He was younger, stronger, and had no fear of the Chicago gangster. Nucky physically pushed Capone into a waiting limousine, containing the situation before it could get worse. But the damage was done. The conference had started with a humiliating rejection, and the most powerful gangster in Chicago was furious at the host. Nucky had to act fast to salvage the situation. He immediately moved everyone to the Ritz-Carlton and Ambassador hotels, properties where Nucky's influence was absolute and where discrimination against Italian and Jewish guests wasn't an issue. The presidential suite at the Ritz was given to Meyer and Anna Lansky for their honeymoon. Champagne flowed, apologies were made, gradually. The situation calmed, but Capone wasn't finished expressing his displeasure. When he got to his room at the Ritz-Carlton, he reportedly ripped paintings off the walls and threw them at Nucky. Other attendees worked to calm him down, explaining that the breakers incident wasn't Nucky's fault, that he had fixed the problem, that they should focus on the business at hand. Eventually, Capone settled down. Perhaps he realized that attacking Nucky Johnson in his own city was suicidal. Nucky controlled the police, the politicians, everything. Or perhaps he simply recognized that the conference was too important to derail over wounded pride. Either way, the crisis passed. The conference could proceed, but it had started badly, and the tension between Capone and Nucky would simmer throughout the 4 days. Once the accommodations were sorted out, the conference settled into its planned schedule. The first 3 days were essentially one extended party. Nucky, ever the gracious host, despite the rough start, spared no expense. The finest food in Atlantic City was served. Lobster, steak, caviar, oysters, Prohibition was, of course, completely ignored champagne, whiskey, wine, and every other alcoholic beverage flowed freely. The finest entertainment was brought in, singers, dancers, musicians. Showgirls circulated among the attendees. It was luxury on a scale that even these wealthy criminals rarely experienced. Nucky gave out gifts. Fur capes were given to the wives and girlfriends. Expensive, fashionable, a gesture of respect and hospitality. Meyer and Anna Lansky received special treatment, with their presidential suite stocked with endless champagne and flowers. Nucky was demonstrating Atlantic City's hospitality, showing these powerful men that his city could provide anything they wanted. But beneath the parties and the gifts, serious business was being conducted during the days. The major figures would retreat to private conference rooms atop the hotels. Here, away from the entertainment and the alcohol, they discussed the future of organized crime in America. The attendee list read like a who's who of American organized crime. From Chicago, Al Capone and Frank the Enforcer Nitti, representing the Chicago outfit. From New York and New Jersey, Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, Frank Kostlow, Dutch Schultz, born Arthur Flegenheimer, and Waxy Gordon, born Irving Wexler. Johnny Torrio attended as an elder statesman. He had retired from active leadership, but remained influential and respected. Representatives came from Detroit, Philadelphia, Cleveland, and Boston. Notably absent were Joe the Boss Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, the two Sicilian bosses who were engaged in a bloody war for control of New York's Italian gangs. Their absence was significant. The conference represented the younger, more Americanized generation of gangsters who were tired of the old world ways. Irish gangsters were only minimally represented. The Irish gangs, once dominant in American organized crime, were being marginalized by the more organized and ruthless Italian and Jewish syndicates. What did they discuss during those private meetings? The historical record provides some details, ending the Chicago beer wars. The violence in Chicago was attracting too much attention. Territory needed to be divided. Agreements needed to be reached. Capone and his rivals needed to find a way to coexist, or at least to fight less publicly. Territorial divisions. The country would be divided into exclusive franchises. Each major organization would control its own territory, and others would respect those boundaries. Disputes would be resolved through arbitration, not violence. The National Crime Syndicate, Using the Big Seven as a model, they discussed creating a national organization that would coordinate operations, resolve disputes, and enforce agreements. This would eventually become La Cosa Nostra's Commission, planning for Prohibition's potential repeal. Some of the smarter gangsters recognized that Prohibition wouldn't last forever. When it ended, they needed to have invested in legitimate liquor businesses, gambling operations, nightclubs, and other enterprises that could continue generating revenue, minimizing competition rather than fighting each other. They would divide markets and maximize profits for everyone. Cooperation would be more profitable than conflict, dealing with law enforcement. Strategies for bribing officials, avoiding prosecution, and managing public relations were discussed. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre had shown what happened when violence got too public. It brought federal attention. They needed to be smarter, more discreet. The irony is that much of this wasn't conducted in secret. Photographs were taken of the gangsters walking on the boardwalk, some with bare feet in the ocean, supposedly discussing business while appearing to be tourists. The Atlantic City Daily Press wrote about Al Capone being in town. The famous and possibly staged photograph of Capone and Nucky together on the boardwalk became iconic. This raises an interesting question. Was the conference really secret, or was it deliberately public? Did Nucky allow or even encourage the publicity? By making the conference visible but non-threatening, just a bunch of businessmen having meetings at a resort. Perhaps he was demonstrating his power while maintaining plausible deniability. Yes, the gangsters were there. Yes, everyone knew it. But what could anyone do about it? This was Atlantic City. This was Nucky's city. The rules didn't apply. On May 16, 1929, the Atlantic City Conference concluded. Agreements had been reached. Territories had been divided. Relationships had been established. The groundwork for the National Crime Syndicate had been laid. The old Mustache Pete's, the traditional Sicilian bosses like Masseria and Maranzano, had been marked for elimination. A new, more Americanized, more businesslike approach to organized crime had been endorsed. Meyer and Anna Lansky left for the rest of their honeymoon. Other attendees departed for their home cities. Al Capone left Atlantic City and immediately drove to Philadelphia. And then something strange happened. Capone was arrested. Philadelphia police arrested Capone for carrying a concealed weapon, a charge that was technically legitimate but unusual. Capone was quickly tried, convicted, and sentenced to 1 year in prison. He served the time at Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. Why? Why would Capone, the most powerful gangster in America, who had just left a major conference, suddenly get arrested on what was essentially a minor charge? Capone himself claimed that he had arranged the arrest. According to his story, he knew that rival gangsters were planning to kill him. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre had created enemies. The pressure was unbearable. So he arranged with friendly Philadelphia police to arrest him on a minor charge, giving him a legitimate reason to be unavailable and untouchable for a while. Prison was safer than the streets. If true, this would be extraordinary. But it's also possible that federal or state authorities saw Capone leave Atlantic City and decided to make a move, using the weapons charge as an excuse. Or perhaps Atlantic City's police, on Nucky's orders, tipped off Philadelphia authorities. Capone had been disrespectful, had caused a scene, had threatened Nucky. Perhaps this was Nucky's revenge, getting Capone arrested the moment he left Atlantic City's protection. We'll likely never know for certain, but the arrest highlighted an important point. Outside Atlantic City, the normal rules applied. Outside Nucky's protection, even Al Capone was vulnerable. The Atlantic City Conference itself had lasting consequences. The organizational structure discussed there would evolve into the Commission, the governing body of American organized crime that still exists in some form today. The territorial agreements reached there would shape organized crime geography for decades. The relationships formed there would survive Prohibition's repeal and transition into other criminal enterprises. And for Nucky Johnson, the conference represented the peak of his influence. He had brought together the most powerful criminals in America. He had demonstrated his indispensability. The man who could provide safety, coordination, and protection. He had hosted a summit that changed the nature of American organized crime. But the conference also had a hidden danger: visibility. Those photographs of gangsters on the boardwalk. Those newspaper articles about Capone in Atlantic City. The general knowledge that major crime figures had gathered there. All of this was documented. All of this created a record. And when federal authorities eventually decided to target Nucky, these connections would be part of the evidence against him. For now, though, Nucky was at the height of his power. The late 1920s were his golden age. Atlantic City prospered, money flowed, the machine ran with perfect efficiency. Nucky lived like a king, ruled like an emperor, and seemed absolutely untouchable. But storms were gathering on the horizon. By late 1929, Nucky Johnson had achieved something remarkable: absolute control of an American city, combined with connections to the most powerful criminals in the nation, all while maintaining the appearance of legitimacy. His official positions gave him legal authority and access: county treasurer, tax collector, clerk of the Supreme Court, various corporate directorships. His unofficial position, boss of the Republican machine, gave him political control. Every elected official in Atlantic County owed their position to Nucky. Every appointed official served at his pleasure. The police took orders from him. The courts decided cases the way he wanted. The business community deferred to him, but Nucky's power wasn't purely force. He had genuinely made Atlantic City wealthy. The city was booming. Tourism was at an all-time high. Over 1,200 hotels and boarding houses operated profitably. The boardwalk was famous across America. Convention Hall, completed in 1929, was the largest in the world. Construction was constant. New hotels, new attractions, new infrastructure. Jobs were plentiful. Businesses thrived. Yes, the prosperity was built on illegal gambling, bootlegging, and prostitution. Yes, the success depended on systematic corruption. But from the perspective of most Atlantic City residents, things were good. Employment was high. Money was flowing. The city had a national reputation. And Nucky, for all his faults, delivered results. His personal wealth was staggering. Later investigations would document that his annual income exceeded $500,000. Equal to over $8 million today. His documented expenses paint the picture of extraordinary luxury. $5,000 annually for his Ritz-Carlton suite and nearby cottage. $2,200 annually for his New York City apartment. $3,000 annually for food. $3,000 annually for clothing, multiple cars, including the famous bright yellow Rolls-Royce and 4 Cadillacs, a staff of servants, including a valet, chauffeurs and maids, jewelry, gifts, entertainment expenses, and this was just what could be documented. How much more did he spend in cash, leaving no record? How much went to mistresses, to political payoffs, to investments hidden under other people's names? Nucky's influence extended beyond Atlantic City. He had connections in state government. Governor Walter Edge owed him his election. He knew congressmen, senators, even had some federal connections. His relationships with major gangsters gave him influence in other cities. If he needed something done in New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, Nucky could make a phone call. He was networked into both legitimate political structures and the criminal underworld. The 9th floor of the Ritz-Carlton was his throne room. People came there seeking favors, and Nucky gave them out like a feudal lord. Jobs for supporters, contracts for businessmen, protection for criminals, solutions for problems. His photographic memory meant he never forgot who owed him what. His natural charm meant people left feeling grateful, even when he was essentially extracting tribute or demanding loyalty. When Nucky lived well, everybody lived well. This was the popular perception, and it had enough truth to it to create genuine loyalty. Nucky wasn't just feared, he was in his way loved. He was generous to individuals. Even as he exploited the system, he helped people. Even as he corrupted their city, this combination, personal kindness and systematic corruption, made him far more dangerous than a simple tyrant would have been. As 1929 drew to a close, Nucky had every reason to believe his empire was secure. He had survived Woodrow Wilson's prosecution nearly 20 years earlier. He had built an organization that seemed unassailable. He had power, wealth, respect, and fear in perfect balance. But October 1929 brought the stock market crash. The Great Depression was beginning, and while Nucky couldn't know it yet, his empire, built on prosperity and excess, was about to face its greatest challenges. The Great Depression hit America like a hammer blow. The stock market crash of October 1929 wiped out billions in wealth. Banks failed, businesses collapsed, unemployment soared. By 1933, 1 in 4 American workers would be unemployed. Families lost their homes. The Dust Bowl devastated agriculture, the American economy, which had seemed invincible during the Roaring '20s, revealed itself as dangerously fragile. For most Americans, the Depression was catastrophic. For Atlantic City and for Nucky Johnson, it was complicated. On one hand, vice is relatively recession-proof. People who gamble don't stop gambling because the economy is bad. If anything, they gamble more, hoping for a lucky break. Prostitution continues regardless of economic conditions. And alcohol, well, some argue that people drink more during hard times. But Atlantic City's vice industry depended on tourism, and tourism depends on disposable income. When millions of Americans were struggling to feed their families, beach vacations became impossible luxuries, hotel occupancy rates declined. Fewer tourists meant fewer gamblers, fewer drinkers, fewer customers for Atlantic City's brothels. Revenue didn't collapse, but it certainly declined for Nucky personally. The impact was less severe. He had wealth accumulated from the boom years. His organization was so deeply entrenched that even reduced revenue still meant enormous income. But for the first time in his career, the trajectory wasn't constantly upward. The machine was still running, but not as smoothly. For a man accustomed to absolute control and ever-increasing wealth, even a slight decline must have been unsettling. But the Depression was just the beginning of Nucky's problems. In 1937 and 1938, William Randolph Hearst's newspaper Empire began publishing a series of exposes about vice and corruption in Atlantic City. The articles frequently mentioned Nucky Johnson by name, detailing his control over the city's gambling, bootlegging, and prostitution operations. The stories were sensational, well-researched, and widely read. Why was Hearst targeting Atlantic City? Why was he specifically going after Nucky? Rumors circulated, and many people believed they knew the answer: a showgirl. According to the stories that circulated in Atlantic City, Hearst had been a regular visitor to the city. He had a particular showgirl who was essentially his Atlantic City girlfriend. Someone he saw when he visited, someone he paid well for her exclusive attention. But at some point, Nucky Johnson got too close to this woman. Whether it was a deliberate insult, a thoughtless seduction, or simply Nucky's well-known appetite for showgirls is unclear. But Hearst, a man of enormous ego and vindictiveness, never forgot, so he weaponized his newspapers. The exposes were supposedly about corruption and public morality. Hearst's papers often took puritanical editorial stances, even as Hearst himself lived extravagantly with his mistress Marion Davies. But the real motivation, according to Atlantic City insiders, was personal revenge. Nucky had taken something that belonged to Hearst, and Hearst was going to make him pay. Whether this story is true or made up, the exposes had an effect. They brought national attention to Atlantic City's corruption. They made Nucky a more visible target. They provided ammunition to reform movements and federal investigators. The articles didn't immediately damage Nucky's local power. He still controlled Atlantic City completely. But they damaged his reputation nationally and made him more vulnerable to outside intervention. And speaking of outside intervention, a much larger threat was approaching. On December 5, 1933, the 21st Amendment was ratified. Repealing the 18th Amendment, Prohibition was over. After 13 years of being illegal, alcohol was legal again, for most Americans. This was cause for celebration. People could drink openly, legally, without fear of arrest. Legitimate businesses could sell alcohol again. The violence and corruption that Prohibition had created could finally end. For Nucky Johnson, Prohibition's repeal was a disaster. Bootlegging had been his primary income source for 13 years. The billions of dollars generated by illegal alcohol had funded everything. His personal wealth, his political machine, his grip on Atlantic City. Now, suddenly, that revenue stream was evaporating. Yes. Gambling was still illegal and still protected. Yes. Prostitution was still illegal and still protected. Yes. Atlantic City still had its reputation as a place where rules didn't apply. But the single biggest source of criminal revenue was gone, overnight. Bootlegging went from being the most profitable criminal enterprise in American history to being essentially worthless. Why buy illegal alcohol when you could buy legal alcohol? Nucky still had income from other sources. He still controlled the political machine, still collected protection money from gamblers and madams, still had his official salaries and his various business interests. He wasn't poor, but he wasn't as rich as he had been. And more importantly, his usefulness to the National Crime Syndicate had diminished. He was no longer the indispensable coordinator of East Coast bootlegging. He was just a local political boss in a second-tier city. The repeal also removed one of Atlantic City's major competitive advantages. During Prohibition, Atlantic City had been special because you could drink there. Now you could drink anywhere. The city still had gambling and prostitution, still had the boardwalk and the beach, but it had lost some of its unique appeal. The same year that Prohibition was repealed, 1933, the federal government filed a property lien against Nucky for additional taxes owed on income earned in 1927. It was a small action, almost routine, but it was a sign. The federal government was looking at Nucky Johnson. They were examining his finances. They were wondering where all his money came from. This man who had survived Woodrow Wilson's prosecution, who had ruled Atlantic City for 2 decades, who had hosted the Atlantic City Conference and coordinated with the most powerful criminals in America. He was finally appearing on the federal government's radar. In late 1937, 3 years after Prohibition's repeal, the Internal Revenue Service formally opened an investigation into Nucky Johnson's finances. The Treasury Department and the Department of Justice coordinated their efforts. FBI Special Agent William Frank led the investigative team. This was the same strategy that had brought down Al Capone. Capone had been untouchable in Chicago, too powerful, too well protected, too violent for anyone to testify against him directly. But the federal government had gotten him on tax evasion. They couldn't prove he was a murderous gangster, but they could prove he'd earned enormous sums of money and hadn't paid taxes on it. In 1931, Capone had been sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. He was released in 1939, his health destroyed by syphilis, his mind deteriorating, his power gone. The tax evasion strategy had worked perfectly. Now they were going to try it on Nucky. Federal agents began the painstaking work of documenting Nucky's lifestyle. They tracked every expensive meal, every tailored suit, every car, every trip. They interviewed hotel staff, retailers, servants, anyone who could provide information about Nucky's spending. They obtained records from the Ritz-Carlton, from car dealerships, from clothing stores. They built a detailed financial profile, showing that Nucky was spending hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. Then they looked at his reported income, around $40,000 a year from his official positions and documented business interests. The math didn't work. You couldn't spend $100,000 on food, clothing, cars, and housing while earning $40,000. The difference had to come from somewhere, and that somewhere was obviously illegal income that Nucky hadn't reported and hadn't paid taxes on. But proving it was difficult. Nucky had been careful. He dealt in cash, he used middlemen. He didn't keep detailed records of his illegal activities. Because of course he didn't. Detailed records would be evidence. The federal investigators needed to find documentation that definitively linked Nucky to illegal income. Meanwhile, Nucky continued ruling Atlantic City as he always had. The investigation was concerning, certainly, but he'd survived prosecution before, in 1911. He had been acquitted while his mentor went to prison. Perhaps he thought he could do it again. Perhaps he believed his political connections would protect him. Perhaps he simply couldn't imagine any other life than the one he'd lived for 25 years. But the federal government was patient and methodical. They had unlimited resources. They had the full backing of the Treasury Department and the Justice Department, and they had time. They would keep investigating, keep documenting, keep building their case until they had something that would stick. As the investigation continued through the late 1930s, federal prosecutors began working their way up the Atlantic City organization. They started at the bottom, arresting numbers runners, charging madams with prostitution offenses, prosecuting small-time operators. Each arrest created pressure, and pressure creates cooperation. Low-level operators were offered deals. Testify against your bosses. Provide information about the protection racket. Help us build a case against the bigger fish. Some refused, loyal to Nucky and the organization. Others, facing serious prison time, talked piece by piece. The federal government was building a picture of how the Atlantic City machine worked, how protection money flowed upward, how political control was maintained. They moved up the chain. Mid-level operators were arrested and prosecuted. More deals were offered, more information was gathered. The investigation was no longer quiet. Everyone in Atlantic City knew the federal government was coming for Nucky. The man who had seemed untouchable for a quarter century was suddenly vulnerable. Nucky's political connections, which had always protected him before, were less helpful against federal prosecution. He controlled Atlantic County's government, yes, but federal prosecutors answered to Washington, not to local political bosses. His relationships with state politicians mattered less when the charges were federal. He could fix a local case, influence a state investigation. But the full weight of the U.S. government was harder to deflect. Still, the case wasn't easy to build. Nucky hadn't left a convenient paper trail. The protection racket operated largely on trust and intimidation. Money changed hands, but written contracts didn't exist. Bank records showed deposits and expenditures, but not illegal income sources. Witnesses could testify about the system generally, but specific criminal acts directly done by Nucky were harder to prove. Then the investigators caught a break. They found something Nucky thought he had destroyed. Among the many threads federal investigators pulled, one led to a particularly damning piece of evidence, a written contract. Nucky had negotiated an agreement with a railroad company operating in Atlantic City. The arrangement was simple and illegal. Nucky would use his political influence to ensure favorable treatment for the railroad's operations in Atlantic City. And in exchange, Nucky would receive 3/5 of the company's profits from certain operations. It was corruption reduced to a written, signed document. Nucky knew the contract was dangerous. At some point, He apparently attempted to destroy all copies. According to later testimony, he thought the copies had been destroyed. Flushed down a toilet, burned, eliminated. The contract was supposed to have vanished, leaving no evidence of the arrangement. But at least one copy survived. Federal investigators found it. They now had documentary evidence that Nucky Johnson had received substantial illegal income from a corrupt business arrangement. More importantly, they could trace the money. The railroad had made payments to Nucky, and those payments could be documented and proven. This was the key to the case, combined with the lifestyle evidence. All that spending on cars, food, clothing, housing, and the testimony from lower-level operators about the protection racket. The railroad contract gave prosecutors a solid foundation for tax evasion charges. The math was straightforward. Nucky had received money from the railroad contract. He had received protection money from gambling and prostitution operations. As various witnesses could testify, his spending far exceeded his legitimate income. Therefore, he had earned substantial unreported income. Therefore, he had evaded taxes on that income. It was the same case they'd used against Capone, but now with even better documentation. On May 10, 1939, after 3 years of investigation, the federal government finally moved. Enoch Nucky Johnson was indicted for income tax evasion. The specific charges focused on tax years 1935, 1936, and 1937. The government alleged that Nucky had evaded $125,000 in taxes on income, received primarily from numbers operators and other illegal sources during those years. That $125,000 in unpaid taxes implied income of several times that amount, money that Nucky had earned but not reported. The indictment sent shockwaves through Atlantic City. For 28 years, more than a quarter century, Nucky had been the absolute boss. He had survived previous prosecutions. He had weathered the Depression, the repeal of Prohibition, various scandals and investigations. He had seemed permanent, eternal, as much a part of Atlantic City as the boardwalk itself. Now he was facing federal charges. And everyone who had watched Al Capone's fate knew what happened to powerful men convicted of tax evasion. Capone had gone to prison in 1931 and emerged in 1939 a broken, insane wreck of a man dying of syphilis. The federal government didn't need to prove you were a gangster. They just needed to prove you hadn't paid your taxes. And if they could prove it, they destroyed you. Nucky hired the best lawyers money could buy. He prepared his defense. He still controlled Atlantic City. The indictment hadn't changed that. The police still answered to him. The court still deferred to him. Locally, he remained powerful, but this wasn't a local case. This was federal, and the trial was coming. The trial began in July 1941, more than 2 years after the indictment. The delay had been filled with pre-trial motions, negotiations, and Nucky's attempts to have the charges dismissed. Nothing had worked. The federal government was determined to prosecute, and they had the evidence to do it. Judge Albert B. Morris presided over the 2-week trial. The prosecution presented their case methodically. The lifestyle evidence showing Nucky's enormous expenditures. The railroad contract proving illegal income. Testimony from various witnesses about the protection racket. The mathematical impossibility of funding his lifestyle on his reported income. Nucky's defense tried to argue that some of his income came from legitimate sources that hadn't been properly documented. They tried to cast doubt on witness testimony. They tried to portray Nucky as a public servant who had been generous to Atlantic City residents and who was now being unfairly targeted. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury didn't need to believe that Nucky was a crime boss or that he controlled a corrupt political machine. Though the prosecution certainly argued both points, they only needed to believe that he had earned income that he hadn't reported and hadn't paid taxes on. And the prosecution had proven that beyond reasonable doubt, The jury convicted Enoch Nucky Johnson on all counts. Judge Maris, in sentencing, didn't mince words. The jury has found, and I think quite properly, that he had set them an example of cheating and defrauding the government, which is to say the least shocking. The sentence: 10 years in federal prison and a fine of $20,000, equal to approximately $390,000 in today's currency. After 28 years as Atlantic City's absolute ruler, Nucky Johnson was going to prison. The velvet hammer had finally fallen. But there would be one last romantic gesture before the cell door closed. On August 1st, 1941, just 10 days before he was scheduled to enter prison, Nucky Johnson married Florence Flossie Osbeck at a quiet ceremony. Flossie was 33 years old, 25 years younger than Nucky. She was a former showgirl from Philadelphia, Swedish-American, beautiful. They had been engaged for 3 years but hadn't married. Why? Perhaps Nucky had been too focused on fighting the indictment. Perhaps he hadn't wanted to tie her to a man facing prison. Perhaps he simply hadn't felt the urgency. But now, with just days before incarceration, with his empire crumbling and his freedom about to be taken, Nucky married the woman he loved, or perhaps loved is too strong. Nucky's capacity for love had perhaps died with Mabel 29 years earlier, but he cared for Flossie enough to marry her on the eve of his imprisonment, giving her his name and presumably making financial arrangements for her support while he was gone. It was a poignant moment. The mighty political boss who had lived like a king for 3 decades, who had never remarried after his first wife's death, despite countless affairs and relationships, finally took another wife just days before entering prison. Was it love, loneliness, a desire to have someone waiting for him on the outside, a way to ensure Flossie would be taken care of? All of the above? We can't know what was in Nucky's heart as he stood at the altar on August 1st, 1941. But we know that 10 days later, on August 11th, 1941, he kissed his new bride goodbye and entered Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary as prisoner number 52,156. The 9th floor of the Ritz-Carlton stood empty. The bright yellow Rolls-Royce sat silent in a garage somewhere. The red carnation would not grace any buttonhole. The man who had been Atlantic City was now just another federal inmate. The era of Nucky Johnson was over, but the story wasn't finished yet. As Nucky entered prison, the question of succession arose. Who would take over the Atlantic City machine? The answer was Frank Hop Farley. Farley had been one of Nucky's key lieutenants, a state senator who had worked closely with the organization for years. With Nucky's blessing, given before imprisonment, Farley assumed leadership of the Republican machine. But Farley was different from Nucky. He was more low-key, less flamboyant. He didn't live in a Ritz-Carlton penthouse or drive a bright yellow Rolls-Royce. He didn't host gangster conferences or pal around with Al Capone. Farley was a different kind of boss. Quieter, more traditional, less personally corrupt. Though still running a corrupt organization, Jimmy Boyd, Nucky's protege and enforcer, continued managing the day-to-day operations of the vice industry, the gambling dens, prostitution, and other illegal activities continued operating under Boyd's supervision. The protection racket continued. Money still flowed, but the glory days were over. Atlantic City during World War II benefited from the war economy. The city became a military training center. Servicemen on leave provided a customer base for the city's various entertainments. But it wasn't the same as the Roaring '20s or even the 1930s. The city was changing, and not for the better. The political machine that Nucky had built would survive for another 30 years under Farley's leadership. Farley would maintain control until 1972, meaning that the Johnson-Farley machine ruled Atlantic City from 1913 to 1972. A remarkable 59 years of continuous political dominance. But everyone knew that Farley was managing Nucky's creation, not building his own empire. The machine was Nucky's, even from prison. Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania became Nucky Johnson's home for the next 4 years. The contrast with his previous life couldn't have been more stark. From a penthouse suite overlooking the Atlantic Ocean to a prison cell, from caviar and champagne to prison food, from being called Sir and Boss to being prisoner 52,156. But Nucky served his time quietly and without incident. He wasn't a gangster in the traditional sense. He hadn't killed anyone, hadn't personally engaged in violence. He was a corrupt politician who had lived extravagantly. Prison was degrading and confining, certainly. But he wasn't in danger from other inmates or staff. He wasn't Al Capone, deteriorating from syphilis and losing his mind. He was just an older man doing time for tax evasion. Did he reflect on his life during those years? Did he feel regret? Did he wonder what he could have done differently? The historical record doesn't give us answers to these questions. Nucky didn't write a memoir, unlike some gangsters. He didn't give extensive interviews. We don't know what he thought about during those long days and nights in Lewisburg. But we can speculate. He had built an empire and seen it collapse. He had wielded absolute power and lost it. He had lived like a king and ended up in prison. He had ruled the city for 28 years and been brought down by something as mundane as tax evasion. That must have produced some reflection, some evaluation of choices made and paths not taken. Or perhaps not. Perhaps Nucky was simply practical about it. He'd taken the risk. He'd enjoyed the rewards. Now he was paying the price. Perhaps he viewed prison as just another phase of life to be endured and survived like any other hardship. Perhaps he was already planning what he would do when he got out, on August 15, 1945. 4 years after entering prison, Nucky Johnson was paroled. He had served his time, the debt to society, at least in legal terms, had been paid, but there was still the matter of the $20,000 fine. Nucky took the pauper's oath, swearing that he was financially unable to pay the fine. This was almost certainly a lie. Nucky had hidden assets. Money squirreled away in various forms, but the government couldn't prove it. So the man who had once spent $500,000 annually swore he was too poor to pay $20,000. And the fine was waived. It was one last clever move. One final manipulation of the system, even in defeat. Nucky Johnson found a way to win a small victory. In August 1945, Nucky Johnson returned to Atlantic City. He was 62 years old, an ex-convict. No longer the boss of anything, his wife Flossie had waited for him. A testament to genuine affection, or perhaps to financial arrangements, Nucky had made for her support. He moved into a house on South Elton Avenue, owned by Flossie's relatives. He lived there with Flossie and his brother Alfred. The contrast with his former life was almost comical. From the entire 9th floor of the Ritz-Carlton to a relative's house. From multiple servants to living as a family member in someone else's home. From powerful Rolls-Royces to, well, we don't know what Nucky drove after prison. But it certainly wasn't a Rolls-Royce. There was speculation that Nucky might try to reclaim his political power. Perhaps run for office now that his prison term was complete, but it never happened. Whether this was Nucky's choice, or whether Frank Farley and the organization made it clear he wasn't welcome back in leadership, we don't know, but Nucky never sought elected office. Never tried to return to his former position. Instead, he took a job as a salesman for an oil company. Think about that. The man who had once controlled every significant economic decision in Atlantic County was now a salesman. The man who had coordinated with Al Capone and Meyer Lansky was now making sales calls and trying to meet quotas. The humbling was complete, but was Nucky actually living on a salesman's income? Almost certainly not. He had hidden money somewhere. Offshore accounts, cash hidden away, assets in other people's names. The pauper's oath was a fiction, and everyone knew it. But Nucky maintained the fiction, lived modestly. at least compared to his earlier extravagance, and kept his head down. Atlantic City itself had changed. The war was over. America was entering a post-war boom, but Atlantic City's glory days were behind it. The city had been built around giving people illicit pleasures in the Prohibition-era. Now Prohibition was long gone. Gambling was still illegal, though still operated. And other vacation destinations were competing effectively. Atlantic City was beginning a slow decline that wouldn't reverse until casino gambling was legalized in 1976. But the political machine Nucky had built continued operating. Frank Farley ran it. Jimmy Boyd managed the vice operations. Protection money still flowed. Political jobs were still given out through patronage. The system Nucky had created outlasted his personal power, though Nucky no longer held official power. He remained a figure of respect and even reverence in Atlantic City. The older generation remembered when he had ruled the city. They remembered his generosity, his parties, his power. They remembered when Nucky living well meant everybody lived well. Local politicians would occasionally come to him for advice. Not officially, not publicly, but privately. Nucky knew more about Atlantic City politics than anyone alive. He knew where all the bodies were buried. Figuratively, he knew how the system really worked. He knew the history, the connections, the leverage points. So they came to the house on South Elton Avenue, these younger politicians, and sat with the old man and asked questions. And Nucky, who had nothing else to do with his time, would tell them stories, give them advice, share his knowledge. He was no longer the boss, but he was still a resource. Jimmy Boyd would visit as well, the protege checking in on his mentor, updating him on how the organization was running, asking advice on difficult situations. The relationship that had started in the 1920s, when Boyd was a bellhop and Nucky was at the height of his power, continued even after Nucky's fall. This loyalty, continuing for decades after it provided any practical benefit to Boyd, suggests that the relationship had genuine affection, not just calculation. Was Nucky bitter about his fall? Did he resent that Frank Farley now sat in the position he had held for nearly 3 decades? Did he miss the power, the luxury, the constant deference? We can only guess. Nucky had always been pragmatic. He had known the risks he was taking. He had played the game and eventually lost. Perhaps he accepted it with the same matter-of-fact practicality he had shown throughout his career. Or perhaps in the quiet of that house on South Elton Avenue, living with his wife and brother, working as a salesman, no longer the center of attention or the wielder of power. Perhaps Nucky Johnson experienced regret. Perhaps he thought about Mabel, dead for 33 years now. Perhaps he thought about different choices he might have made, different paths he might have taken. Perhaps he wondered what his life would have been like if he had stayed in education. Become that English literature professor, lived a normal, modest, legal life. But those thoughts, if he had them, died with him. Nucky Johnson was not a man who shared his inner life with the world. In 2010, HBO premiered Boardwalk Empire, a television series produced by Martin Scorsese and Mark Wahlberg. Created by Terrence Winter, who had written for The Sopranos. The show ran for 5 seasons, concluding in 2014, and brought Nucky Johnson's story to millions of viewers. Steve Buscemi played the lead character. Nucky Thompson, note the name change, Thompson, not Johnson. The show was set in Prohibition-era Atlantic City and dealt with bootlegging, gangsters, corruption, and violence. It was critically acclaimed, won numerous awards, and introduced a new generation to the story of Atlantic City's corrupt boss. But the HBO show differed significantly from reality. The creators had chosen to fictionalize the story, changing names and inventing plot lines to give themselves creative freedom. This is their right. They were making entertainment, not documentary. But it's worth noting the differences between the real Nucky Johnson and the fictional Nucky Thompson. Violence. The television Nucky Thompson personally kills people. He's involved in shootouts, murders, violence. The real Nucky Johnson was never known to have personally killed anyone. There's no evidence he ever ordered a murder. He ruled through corruption and political control. Not violence. This is perhaps the most significant difference. The real Nucky was the Velvet Hammer. Not a violent gangster, business operations. The show depicts Nucky running his own bootlegging operation, competing directly with other gangsters, managing distilleries and smuggling operations. The real Nucky took percentages from others' operations, but didn't run his own. He was the political enabler and protector. Not the operational boss. He coordinated and taxed, but didn't compete marriage. The show has Nucky Thompson remarrying in 1921. Shortly after his wife's death, the real Nucky didn't remarry until 1941, just before going to prison, a gap of 29 years. This suggests a much deeper psychological impact from Mabel's death than the show portrays. Religion and ethnicity. The television Nucky is portrayed as Irish Catholic. The real Nucky was Protestant Methodist from an old American family. This isn't a minor detail. It affects his relationships with other characters and his position in Atlantic City society. Ending, without spoiling the show for those who haven't seen it. The television series ends very differently than Nucky Johnson's actual life. The real Nucky lived to age 85 and died peacefully of natural causes. Not through violence. These differences don't make Boardwalk Empire bad television. It's excellent entertainment, but viewers should understand that it's inspired by Nucky Johnson's story. Not a documentary recreation of it. The real man was, in many ways, more interesting than the fictional version precisely because he achieved and maintained power without personal violence. The 1950s and 1960s were quiet decades for Nucky Johnson. He lived modestly with Flossie, worked his sales job, occasionally advised younger politicians, and watched Atlantic City slowly decline. The city's political machine continued operating, but the glory days were long past. Frank Farley maintained control through the 1950s and 1960s. But challenges were emerging. Civil rights movements were changing American politics. Reform movements were gaining strength. The old political machines that had dominated American cities for decades were being dismantled or transformed. Atlantic City itself was declining economically. Other vacation destinations were drawing tourists away. The city's infrastructure was aging. Without the boom of Prohibition and the immediate post-war years, revenue was insufficient to maintain everything. The boardwalk was still famous, but the city behind it was deteriorating. In 1964, the Democratic National Convention was held in Atlantic City, a sign that the city still had some national prominence. But it would be one of the last great national events the city would host before its long decline. Nucky, now in his 80s, was largely a footnote to history. Younger Atlantic City residents might not even know who he was. Older residents remembered, but their numbers were dwindling. The man who had been Atlantic City was becoming forgotten, even in his own city. But he had Flossie, and he had his brother Alfred. And he had his memories, and perhaps that was enough. Perhaps after all the power and wealth and excitement and eventual humiliation, a quiet life was actually welcome. Perhaps the old man was content. On December 9th, 1968, Enoch Lewis Nucky Johnson died at the Atlantic County Convalescent Home in Northfield, New Jersey. He was 85 years old. He had been unconscious for 25 hours before death came. When it came, it was peaceful. Just the slow stopping of an old man's body finally wearing out. He didn't die in a hail of bullets like so many of his gangster contemporaries. He wasn't murdered by rivals or informants. He didn't die insane from disease like Al Capone. He simply grew old and died, which for a man in his profession was almost miraculous. The newspapers carried obituaries. Of course, Nucky Johnson, Atlantic City political boss, dies at 85. They recounted his career, his power, his conviction, his later years. They noted that he had been born to rule Atlantic City, that he had flair, flamboyance, political immorality, and ruthlessness combined with a natural gift of command. But there was no state funeral, no streets named in his honor, no monuments. Louis Cantel, Nucky's mentor, has an avenue named after him in Atlantic City. Frank Farley has a service area on the Garden State Parkway named after him. But Nucky Johnson, who ruled longer and more absolutely than either of them, has no such memorial. Perhaps that's appropriate. His memorial is Atlantic City itself, the city he shaped, the system he built, the philosophy he embodied. All of it continued after his death. When casino gambling was legalized in Atlantic City in 1976, 8 years after Nucky's death, it was essentially a vindication of his approach. Give people what they want, even if it's supposedly immoral, and they'll pay for it. Modern Atlantic City, with its casinos and entertainment, its glamour and its seediness, its wealth and its poverty existing side by side, it's all Nucky's legacy. He created the template, Atlantic City as playground, a place where rules don't quite apply, a resort built on vice turned legitimate. He's buried somewhere in New Jersey. The exact location isn't widely known or visited. No pilgrimage site, no elaborate tomb, just an old man in a grave. His story mostly forgotten except by historians and, decades later, by viewers of an HBO show that changed his name and his story, but preserved something of his legend. What made Nucky Johnson different from other gangster bosses of his era? Why did he succeed for 28 years when so many others died young or were imprisoned quickly? The answer lies in his unique approach to power, the Velvet Hammer philosophy that gave him his nickname. Most gangsters of Nucky's era were violent men. Al Capone's organization killed hundreds of people. Lucky Luciano ordered murders routinely. Dutch Schultz was a psychopath who killed on impulse. Bugsy Siegel was called Bugsy because he was crazy. Unpredictable, violent, these men ruled through fear. Raw physical fear of being killed. Nucky was different. There's no credible evidence he ever personally killed anyone. There's no solid proof he ever ordered a murder. His organization operated for decades without the gangland violence that characterized Chicago, New York, and other cities. How? The answer is that Nucky understood something fundamental. Violence is inefficient. Violence attracts attention. Every murder brings police scrutiny. Every gang war brings newspaper headlines. Every shooting risks hitting an innocent bystander, creating public outrage and demands for crackdown. Violence is messy, unpredictable, and counterproductive when your goal is systematic. Long-term corruption. Nucky ruled through corruption instead. He bought the police, so enforcement wasn't needed. He controlled the courts, so legal problems could be fixed. He owned the politicians, so laws could be shaped to his benefit. He employed people, gave them jobs and money, creating loyalty through economic benefit rather than fear of death. This required a different skill set than traditional gangsterism. Nucky needed political skill, organizational ability, patience, and social intelligence. He needed to remember faces and names, build relationships, maintain complex networks of obligation and loyalty. He needed to know when to be generous and when to be firm, when to grant favors and when to call them in. The velvet part of Velvet Hammer was his charm, his generosity, his personal magnetism. People genuinely liked Nucky, or at least felt positively toward him. He helped people. He created prosperity. He was personally gracious and attentive. The velvet made the hammer easier to accept. Nucky Johnson occupies a unique position in American criminal history. He was simultaneously a legitimate political figure and a crime boss. This wasn't unusual in itself. Many cities had corrupt political machines. But Nucky perfected the model. Compare Nucky to other famous political bosses. Boss Tweed of Tammany Hall in New York stole an estimated $200 million in 1870s dollars through corruption. But he didn't systematically protect illegal vice operations. His corruption was financial. Inflated government contracts, bribery, graft. Not protection of gambling and prostitution. Tom Pendergast of Kansas City was perhaps closest to Nucky's model. He controlled Kansas City politics and protected bootleggers, gamblers, and other vice operators. But Pendergast was less flamboyant than Nucky, less personally involved in the operations he protected. Huey Long in Louisiana wielded enormous power and was certainly corrupt. But Long was focused on maintaining political power for its own sake and for implementing his admittedly grandiose policy vision. He wasn't primarily focused on profiting from vice. Nucky was different. He used political power explicitly and primarily to enable and profit from illegal vice operations. The political machine wasn't the end goal. It was the tool for building a criminal empire. Government wasn't something to loot through graft and kickbacks. Though Nucky did that too, it was the enforcement mechanism for the protection racket. This created a fascinating hybrid, the gangster politician or politician gangster. Nucky had the legitimacy of elected and appointed office. County treasurer, tax collector, Supreme Court clerk. He attended Republican conventions, met with governors, was photographed at official events. He was part of legitimate society in ways that Al Capone or Lucky Luciano never were. But simultaneously, he was coordinating with bootleggers, hosting gangster conferences, taking percentages from gambling and prostitution, enabling systematic violation of law. He was as much a crime boss as Capone, just operating through different mechanisms. This dual nature made Nucky more dangerous in some ways. A pure gangster can be fought through law enforcement. A pure corrupt politician can be fought through reform movements and elections. But Nucky was both. He had the legitimacy to deflect reform efforts and the criminal enterprise to fund his political machine and buy protection. He had the benefits of both worlds. It also made him more vulnerable in one specific way. His legitimacy required maintaining appearances. A pure gangster can go underground, operate in secret, avoid the public eye. Nucky had to be visible, had to maintain his public positions, had to operate at least partly in the open. This visibility eventually contributed to his downfall. The federal government could track his lifestyle, document his spending, build their case because Nucky couldn't completely hide. What did it cost Nucky Johnson to be the boss of Atlantic City for 28 years? The monetary cost was obvious eventually, prison and a destroyed reputation. But the personal cost was perhaps higher. Consider his marriage to Mabel Jeffries in 1906. She died in 1912 when Nucky was just 29 years old. He didn't remarry for 29 years, for nearly 3 decades. The most powerful man in Atlantic City lived alone. Yes, he had affairs with showgirls. Yes, he surrounded himself with people. Yes, his days were filled with activity, power, and luxury. But he lived alone. Was this by choice? Perhaps Nucky couldn't find anyone he loved the way he loved Mabel. Perhaps the kind of women who attracted him, showgirls, entertainers, weren't the kind he could imagine marrying. Perhaps his life was too corrupt, too dangerous, too morally compromised for him to invite someone he truly cared about into it. Perhaps after Mabel's death, he simply closed off that part of himself, focusing all his energy on power and money instead of love. Or perhaps it was more calculating. A wife would be a vulnerability. She could be threatened, kidnapped, used as leverage. Children would be even worse. Hostages to fortune, pressure points that enemies could exploit. By remaining unmarried and childless, Nucky eliminated those vulnerabilities. But he also eliminated the possibility of family, of the kind of human connection that most people consider essential to a meaningful life. When Nucky finally did remarry to Flossie Osbeck in 1941, just days before prison, he was 58 years old. His career was over. His power was gone. His wealth was hidden or gone. He married Flossie on the eve of imprisonment, giving her his name and then immediately leaving her for 4 years. It's romantic in a tragic way, but it's also desperately sad. The man who had everything Atlantic City could offer didn't have love for most of his life. The cost of power included friends too. Or rather, the absence of real friends when you're the boss. Everyone who's nice to you wants something. Every relationship is transactional. Every interaction is calculated. Nucky had hundreds of people who called him friend. But how many actually cared about him as opposed to caring about what he could do for them? When he went to prison, when his power evaporated, how many people stuck around because they genuinely valued him rather than his position? Jimmy Boyd did, apparently. The relationship between Nucky and Boyd seems to have had genuine affection beyond calculation. But Boyd was also benefiting from his association with Nucky. He ran the organization after Nucky's fall. Was it loyalty or self-interest? Probably both, as most human relationships are, but Nucky couldn't be sure. When you've lived your entire adult life in a world of corruption and manipulation, can you ever really trust anyone's motives? The cost also included fear. Nucky avoided personal violence and largely avoided violent enemies. But he must have lived with constant awareness that everything could collapse. One federal prosecution, which eventually happened, one betrayal, one shift in political power in Trenton or Washington, one reform movement that actually gained traction. His entire empire rested on maintaining control of inherently unstable systems that must have created constant stress, even if Nucky didn't show it publicly. And finally, there was the cost to his moral self. Nucky enabled prostitution, which meant he enabled exploitation of women, many of whom were poor, uneducated, and had few alternatives. He enabled gambling, which ruined families and destroyed lives. He enabled bootlegging, which enriched violent criminals and corrupted law enforcement. He corrupted government, destroying the integrity of democratic institutions. He lived his entire adult life in systematic violation of the law and the principles of honest government. Did this bother him? Did Nucky Johnson have a conscience that troubled him? We don't know. He left no memoir, no confession, no record of moral struggle. His public persona was unrepentant. He openly defended his approach, argued that he was simply giving people what they wanted. But what about in private? What about lying in bed at night in his Ritz-Carlton suite, alone, drinking because his wife was dead and he'd chosen power over love? What did Nucky Johnson think about the life he'd chosen? We can't know, but the costs of power, even when power brings wealth and prestige, are always higher than they appear from the outside. Nucky Johnson ruled Atlantic City, but the price might have been his soul. What can we learn from Nucky Johnson's life and career? What lessons does his story offer? Lesson 1. Systematic corruption is more dangerous than random criminality. A few corrupt cops taking bribes can be rooted out and replaced. But when an entire system, police, courts, politicians, is coordinated in corruption, reform becomes nearly impossible. Nucky's genius was systematizing corruption, making it institutional rather than individual. This made it far more durable and far more difficult to fight. Lesson 2. The velvet hammer is more effective than the iron fist. Violence attracts attention and creates enemies, corruption, especially when combined with genuine benefits for ordinary people, can create loyalty and stability. Nucky's non-violent approach allowed him to rule far longer than his violent contemporaries. The lesson: power built on fear is unstable. Power built on complicity and benefit is far more durable. Lesson 3. You can't control everything forever. For 28 years, Nucky seemed untouchable, but eventually federal prosecution found him vulnerable. The lesson: no matter how complete your control seems, there are always forces beyond your reach. Thinking yourself untouchable is dangerous. Lesson 4. Build institutions, not personal empires. Nucky's machine survived him by decades because he built an institution with trained successors and systematic procedures. Most gangster empires collapsed when their founders died or were imprisoned. Nucky's survived. The lesson: institutional thinking is more powerful than personal ambition. Lesson 5: Tax evasion brings down titans. From Capone to Nucky to countless others, it's not the dramatic crimes that catch up with powerful criminals. It's the mundane crime of not paying taxes, the lesson. The federal government's patience and the IRS's thoroughness are more dangerous than rival gangsters. Lesson 6: History remembers, but not always fairly. Nucky is remembered today largely through a fictionalized HBO show that changed his name and his story. The lesson: how you're remembered depends partly on accident, partly on who tells your story. Legacy is uncertain. These lessons are applicable beyond organized crime. They're lessons about power, corruption, institutions, human nature, and the eternal tension between law and liberty, order and freedom, the individual and society. Nucky Johnson's story is uniquely American, but the lessons are universal. So who was Enoch Nucky Johnson? After examining his life in detail, after analyzing his methods and his impact, his successes and his failures, what final assessment can we make? He was first and foremost a political genius. His ability to build and maintain a political machine for 28 years, his systematic approach to corruption, his understanding of how to wield power, these mark him as an extraordinary political operator. He understood institutions, human nature, and power dynamics at a sophisticated level. He was a criminal, however sophisticated his methods, however non-violent his approach, however much economic benefit he created for Atlantic City. The core of his career was organized crime. He enabled and profited from illegal gambling, prostitution, and bootlegging. He corrupted government institutions. He systematically violated the law for personal profit. He was complex. Nucky contained contradictions that were never resolved. He was generous and exploitative. He was charming and ruthless. He created prosperity while enabling vice. He helped individuals while corrupting systems. He lived extravagantly while many struggled. These contradictions make him fascinating but also troubling. He defies simple moral categorization. He was American. Nucky's story could only happen in America, specifically in Prohibition-era America. The gap between public morality and private behavior. The federal system that allowed local corruption. The economic opportunities created by Prohibition. The political machine tradition. All of these were distinctively American phenomena. Nucky Johnson is an American original, for better and worse. He was a survivor, living to age 85, and dying peacefully when almost all his gangster contemporaries died young and violently marks Nucky as extraordinary. His survival suggests intelligence, adaptability, and perhaps wisdom. Knowing when to fight and when to accept defeat, he was the Velvet Hammer. This nickname captures something essential about Nucky. Power without violence, control through corruption rather than fear, systematic rather than chaotic criminality. The Velvet Hammer approach was his innovation and his legacy. He was finally human. For all his power and wealth, Nucky experienced loss. Mabel's death, loneliness, 29 years unmarried, failure, conviction and imprisonment, and diminishment. His last decades living modestly. He wasn't a monster or a superhuman criminal mastermind. He was a man who made certain choices, enjoyed certain successes, suffered certain consequences. If we must summarize in a single sentence, Enoch Nucky Johnson was a brilliant and ruthless political boss who perfected the art of systematic corruption, ruled Atlantic City absolutely for nearly 3 decades through intelligence and organization rather than violence, and ultimately paid for his crimes through imprisonment and the collapse of his empire, but who also survived to old age and left an institutional legacy that outlasted him by decades. He was neither hero nor simple villain. He was a fascinating and important figure in American history whose story illuminates uncomfortable truths about American culture, politics, and the eternal human struggles with vice, virtue, power, and corruption. In 2010, more than 4 decades after Nucky Johnson's death, HBO premiered Boardwalk Empire, the series. Produced by Martin Scorsese and Mark Wahlberg, created by Terrence Winter, brought Nucky's story to millions of viewers worldwide. Steve Buscemi's portrayal of Nucky Thompson, note the name change, was critically acclaimed. The show won numerous Emmy Awards. It introduced a new generation to Prohibition-era Atlantic City and to the story of the city's corrupt boss. But as discussed earlier, the show significantly fictionalized Nucky's story. The television Nucky was more violent, more personally involved in bootlegging operations, more dramatic than the real man. This is the show's right. They were making entertainment, not documentary, and they created excellent television. But the show also means that many people's understanding of Nucky Johnson comes from fiction rather than history. When people think of Nucky, they think of Steve Buscemi's performance, not the real man. They think of shootouts and murders that never happened. They think of a character rather than a historical figure. This raises interesting questions about historical memory and popular culture. HBO's Boardwalk Empire will reach far more people than any historical account ever will. For most people, Steve Buscemi is Nucky, regardless of historical accuracy. The fictional version has displaced the real one in popular consciousness. Is this good or bad? Arguments can be made both ways. On one hand, the show has made Nucky's story famous. People who would never read a history book about Prohibition-era corruption have become fascinated with Atlantic City's political boss. The show has driven interest in the real history, leading some viewers to research the actual facts. That's valuable. On the other hand, fiction pretending to be history, even when the show's creators are clear about the fictionalization, can distort understanding. People leave the show thinking they know about Nucky Johnson when they actually know about a fictional character inspired by him, the real man. More interesting in some ways than the fictional version is lost. Perhaps the solution is to view the HBO show and the historical reality as complementary rather than competing. The show tells a story inspired by Nucky's life. The history tells what actually happened. Both can be appreciated on their own terms. What's certain is that HBO's Boardwalk Empire has ensured that Nucky Johnson won't be forgotten. Whether the man remembered is the real Nucky or the fictional one is less clear. But in an age where most historical figures fade into obscurity within decades of their deaths, Nucky has been resurrected through popular culture. That's its own kind of legacy, and there you have it, the complete, unvarnished story of Nucky Johnson, the Velvet Hammer of Atlantic City. From under-sheriff to undisputed boss, from the Ritz-Carlton to federal prison, from power to peace. If you made it this far, you're a real one. How long did this take you? Were you awake the whole time, or did you drift off and come back? Drop a comment and let me know what you thought about Nucky's story. Did you find his Velvet Hammer approach more fascinating than the violent gangsters? Do you think he was a criminal or just a product of his time? Let's discuss in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep dive, there are so many more stories to tell. What story should I cover next? Tell me in the comments. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications on so you don't miss the next epic gangster story. Hit that like button if this helped you sleep, learn something new, or just pass the time. Share it with friends who love true crime and history. Thanks for spending these hours with me, exploring the life of one of America's most fascinating political criminals. Until next time, stay curious, stay comfortable, and remember, sometimes the most dangerous criminals wear suits and smiles, not guns and scowls. This has been the story of Nucky Johnson. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next one.